The rain in downtown Seattle had that cold February attitude that crawled through your sleeves and made everybody walk faster, without admitting why. My Uber dropped me in front of Le Marin Seafood Reserve at exactly 7:15 p.m., and for a second I just stood there staring at the gold lettering on the windows while water rolled off the shoulders of my faded olive jacket. 9 months in herbal moving fuel, medical shipments, and armored vehicle parts through active conflict zones, and somehow the thing making my stomach tighten was valet parking outside a seafood restaurant. I still had red dust stuck in the seams as my duffel bag. A young valet in a navy coat reached for it and gave me that quick up-and-down look civilians always gave military people when we weren't in uniform. Like he couldn't tell if I was important or homeless. "Long flight?" he asked. "Depends who you ask." He laughed politely even though I wasn't joking. Inside, Le Marin looked exactly like the kind of place my mother loved pretending belonged to her social circle. Dark mahogany walls, low amber lighting, waiters moving around like they were handling organ transplants instead of lobster tails. Somewhere near the back, somebody was playing soft jazz on a piano that probably cost more than my Tacoma back home. And there they were. My family had already turned the table into a crime scene of expensive decisions. Towering silver seafood platters sat on crushed ice between half-empty champagne bottles and little crystal dishes of sauce nobody actually liked, but rich people always pretended to enjoy. There were crab legs stacked like construction materials, oyster shells scattered everywhere, and enough melted butter on the table to lubricate a submarine engine. Julian was in the middle of talking before I even reached them. "No, listen," he said loudly, holding court like a guy who thought podcasts counted employment. "The matte black package is impossible to get unless you know somebody at the dealership." My mother practically glowed looking at him. Margaret Vance had spent my entire life treating Julian like he was one successful handshake away from becoming a Kennedy. She wore a cream-colored blazer with giant gold buttons and enough jewelry to trigger airport security from across the street. Her champagne glass was already half empty. Nobody noticed me standing there for the first few seconds. That part actually impressed me. Then my father looked up first. "There she is," Arthur said, weakly, like he'd spotted a neighbor at the grocery store instead of his daughter returning from a combat zone deployment. Margaret turned her head, smiled for maybe half a second, then waved one manicured hand toward the empty chair at the far end of the table. "Elena, sweetheart, sit before your food gets cold." There was no hug, no welcome home, not even eye contact long enough to fake sincerity. Just logistics. Funny thing was, logistics happened to be my specialty. I slid into the cramped chair beside a decorative plant that was probably worth more than my first apartment rent in Fayetteville. My duffel bag rested against my boots while a waiter appeared instantly beside me, holding a wine list the size of a legal document. "Still or sparkling?" "Sparkling." He nodded and disappeared. Julian finally leaned back enough to acknowledge me. "You look tired," he said. "I flew 19 hours. Yeah, that'll do it." Then he went right back to talking about his car. Not his company, not his work, the car. That usually meant the company wasn't doing great. I listened while he doled ceramic brake packages and custom Italian stitching, like he personally engineered the vehicle instead of financing it at criminal interest rates. Every few minutes, my mother jumped in to praise him like he'd cured a disease. Meanwhile, I still smelled faintly like military aircraft and recycled cabin air. A waiter placed my sparkling water in front of me at 7:28 p.m. sharp. Condensation rolled down the glass while another server carried over a seafood tower so massive it needed structural support. "Alaskan king crab for the table," he announced proudly. Julian grinned. "Only because Mom said tonight was special." I almost laughed at that. Special. 3 days earlier, I'd been standing inside a military cargo terminal at 4:40 a.m. watching a forklift operator scream at a shipment manifest because somebody misplaced 2 pallets of hydraulic components headed for Fort Kuwait. 20 hours before that, incoming rockets had shut down movement across half the base for nearly an hour. And now I was sitting under chandelier lighting, listening to my brother explain imported leather seats. America really knew how to give people emotional whiplash. "So," Margaret said finally, turning toward me just enough to satisfy basic social customs. "How was the desert?" The desert. Like I'd spent 9 months at some overpriced yoga retreat for divorced women. "Hot," I said. Arthur chuckled nervously into his whiskey. Margaret nodded once and immediately pivoted back toward Julian. I watched her do it in real time, that tiny choice. that tiny dismissal. People think disrespect arrives with yelling or slammed doors. It usually doesn't. Usually it's quieter than that. Usually it looks like someone deciding your story can wait while they admire somebody else's leased BMW. The waiter circled the table cracking crab legs while butter dripped onto expensive white linen. Julian kept ordering appetizers nobody finished. My father kept drinking like he hoped bourbon could dissolve tension before it reached him. And I sat there realizing something uncomfortable. I knew more about the movement of armored supply convoys through northern Iraq than I knew about my own family anymore. Nobody asked if I was sleeping okay. Nobody asked if I lost people overseas. Nobody asked what deployment did to your brain after month 7 when every loud sound started feeling important. Margaret suddenly laughed at something. Julian whispered and touched his arm proudly. "You deserve this celebration," she told him. That line landed harder than she realized. Because technically this dinner was supposed to be my homecoming. Have you ever walked into a room where people already decided your value before you even opened your mouth? Where the person working the hardest somehow becomes the least interesting one at the table? Comment below. And if you enjoy stories about family, respect, and the moment people finally stop accepting bad treatment, subscribe to the channel. I picked up my water glass and looked around the table one more time. I had survived mortar alarms, military audits, and a sandstorm that nearly flipped a transport truck outside Erbil. But somehow this table felt lonelier than all of them. I was a stranger at my own homecoming. I loosened my grip on the cold glass before I cracked it in my hand. The waiter cleared another pile of empty oyster shells while Julian leaned back in his chair, like a man who personally owned the Pacific Ocean. By then, it was a little after 8 p.m., and the restaurant had shifted into that louder Friday night rhythm where everybody was half drunk and trying too hard to sound successful. Julian loved environments like that. He snapped his fingers lightly toward the waiter. "Let's do another king crab round," he said, "and the reserve caviar platter this time." The waiter nodded immediately. No hesitation. That told me 2 things. First, this wasn't their first expensive order of the night. Second, Julian had absolutely no intention of paying for any of it. Margaret smiled proudly like her son had just negotiated a peace treaty. "You only live once," she announced to nobody in particular. I took a sip of sparkling water and watched my family spend money they did not have with the confidence of people who assumed somebody else would absorb the impact later. That somebody had usually been me for years. Not directly, never openly. It was always framed differently. Elena makes good money now. Elena doesn't really have expenses. Elena's disciplined with finances. Elena understands sacrifice. Funny how the responsible child slowly becomes the emergency backup generator for everybody else's bad decisions. The caviar arrived on a silver tray around 8:17 p.m. The waiter explained the imported reserve selections with the seriousness of a surgeon discussing organ transport. Tiny glass bowls, handmade blinis, gold serving spoons, $650 for fish eggs. I'd coordinated emergency fuel rerouting operations overseas that cost less per person. Julian scooped a giant portion onto a cracker and took a bite like he was starring in a commercial for bad financial judgment. "Oh my God," Margaret laughed. "That is unbelievable." Arthur nodded along even though I knew for a fact he hated seafood. My father had spent 30 years pretending agreement counted as peacekeeping. He worked as a regional insurance adjuster most of his life. Quiet guy, soft-spoken. The kind of man who apologized to furniture after bumping into it. Somewhere along the line, he figured the easiest way to survive marriage was to never challenge Margaret on anything important, especially not Julian. "So tell them about the Phoenix deal," Margaret said excitedly. Julian wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and grinned. "It's still early," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "but we're probably looking at 7 figures once the investors finalize." Investors, plural. That was new. Last Christmas, he was pitching some crypto-adjacent app designed to disrupt luxury. Networking. Before that, it was NFT consulting. Before that, he wanted to launch a high-end coffee brand that somehow involved motivational speaking. Every 6 months, Julian reinvented himself like a Netflix startup documentary nobody asked for. Margaret ate it up every single time. A couple sitting nearby glanced over with polite interest while she practically beamed with pride. "My son's in tech," she told them. The woman nodded politely. "Oh wow. Seattle's perfect for that." Julian gave this fake humble shrug that made me want to chew glass. "It's been a grind, a grind." I stared at him for a second too long. 3 weeks earlier, I'd spent 19 straight hours resolving a shipping backlog after a contractor issue delayed medical refrigeration units headed towards a forward operating location. Nobody there used the word grind. They used phrases like fix it now before somebody dies. But apparently, leasing an Audi and lying near shellfish counted too. Margaret finally looked toward me again. Elena, do they even let you invest while deployed? That was her question. Not how deployment went. Not whether I was okay. Not whether I made it home safely. Just whether the military interfered with portfolio management. Depends on the investment, I said. Julian smirked. You should let me manage some money for you sometime. I almost choked on my water. Arthur laughed too quickly, trying to smooth things over before tension could breathe. That's enough, son. No, seriously, Julian continued. You've probably got decent savings after living overseas for free all year. There it was. Finally. The real conversation underneath the fake reunion. Not family, not love, money. I leaned back slightly and looked around the table while another seafood tower arrived, dripping melted ice across polished silver trays. Nobody asked what deployment paid emotionally, only financially. The thing about military deployments people don't understand is the money sounds better on paper than it feels in real life. Sure, housing was covered overseas. Hazard pay helped. Tax exclusions helped. You know what else happens? You miss funerals. You forget what silence sounds like without generators running in the background. You stop sleeping deeply because your brain keeps waiting for alarms. And apparently, when you come home, your family calculates your value like they're reviewing quarterly earnings. Margaret pointed toward the champagne bottle. We should book Napa this summer, she said, before prices get insane again. Julian nodded immediately. We could rent that vineyard property from the Reynolds guy. Arthur looked uncertain. That place was expensive. Margaret waved him off. Everything is expensive now. Then she turned toward me with that casual tone people use right before volunteering your wallet for public service. You'll probably be stationed stateside for a while now, right? Maybe you can finally relax and enjoy life with us. Enjoy life with us. Interesting phrase, because nobody at that table had included me in the actual vacation discussion. No, we should all go. No, you'd love it there. No, we missed you. I was being discussed like a future funding source. The waiter cracked another crab leg beside me and accidentally splashed butter near my sleeve. Sorry about that, Mom. It's okay. Honestly, he treated me with more consideration than my family had all night. Julian kept talking. Margaret kept admiring him. Arthur kept disappearing deeper into silence. And somewhere between the third seafood platter and the second champagne bottle, I realized something that sat heavier than anger. My family didn't actually care what I survived overseas. They cared what surviving overseas could buy them afterward. Their affection had terms and conditions attached, and I was starting to understand the exchange rate. The fourth champagne bottle arrived right as I checked the time on my phone. 9:42 p.m. Seattle rain streaked down the restaurant windows in long silver lines, while the dinner crowd settled into that sluggish late evening mood where people either got sentimental or financially irresponsible. At our table, we had somehow achieved both. A pianist near the bar started playing an old Frank Sinatra song, low enough to sound expensive. Then the head waiter appeared. Not our regular server. The head waiter. That alone told me the bill had crossed into dangerous territory. He approached carrying a black leather folio with both hands like it contained classified nuclear launch codes. Tall guy. Gray hair slicked perfectly back. Calm expression. The kind of professional restaurant face that could survive watching billionaires argue over oysters without blinking once. Whenever you are ready, he said politely. He placed the folio directly in the center of the table, and nobody touched it. Julian kept talking about some fake investor meeting in Scottsdale. Arthur stared into his whiskey. Margaret adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. I looked down at the leather folder sitting there between melted ice buckets and empty crab shells, and suddenly the entire night made sense with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a reunion dinner. This was an extraction operation. The pause stretched just long enough to become awkward. Then Margaret smiled, not warmly, strategically. She slid the leather folio across the tablecloth with 2 manicured fingers until it stopped directly in front of me beside my untouched bread plate. There we go, she said sweetly. Julian didn't even look surprised. That part hit harder than I expected. Nobody at that table reacted like something unusual was happening. No hesitation, no discussion, no fake argument over splitting costs. This had been decided before I even landed in Seattle. I opened the folder slowly, 5,318.45 cents. I actually respected the number for a second. That took commitment. 3 king crab rounds, reserve caviar, imported champagne, premium shellfish towers, private reserve desserts I hadn't even noticed getting ordered. Somebody had apparently purchased a bottle of Japanese whiskey priced like medical equipment. I looked up. Margaret was watching me carefully now. "There's no rush," she said with a little laugh. "I know military banking apps are always complicated." Julian smirked into his drink. Arthur still said nothing. And there it was again, that feeling. Not anger yet. Something colder. Like realizing you've been invited somewhere under false pretenses and everybody else received the real itinerary except you. Margaret leaned back comfortably in her chair. "I just think it's important for family to celebrate each other," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "especially after everything your brothers accomplished this year." Accomplished. Interesting word choice for a man whose startup office was probably as well as a Starbucks with Wi-Fi. I kept staring at the receipt. $5,318.45. Back overseas, I had approved emergency replacement generators for an entire communications section that cost less than this dinner. And at least generators served a purpose. Margaret took another sip of champagne before delivering the line she'd clearly rehearsed ahead of time. "I mean, Elena, you've had almost no expenses living overseas playing soldier all year." Playing soldier. I felt my jaw tighten slightly, not enough for them to notice, just enough for me. She continued smiling while she spoke. "That money's just been sitting there, and honestly, covering a celebration dinner for your brother is the least you could do for your family. Family. Funny how that word only appeared around invoices." Julian finally chimed in. "Plus you get all those military bonuses, right?" I looked at him carefully. "You mean deployment pay?" "Yeah, that's hazard compensation." He shrugged. "Still money." I almost laughed. This man had spent the last 2 hours pretending leased vehicles were business achievements, and now he was reducing combat zone compensation to extra vacation cash. Margaret leaned closer. "And sweetheart, it's not like you have children or a mortgage." There it was. The full audit of my usefulness. No husband, no kids, military career, savings account, therefore available for redistribution. Arthur finally cleared his throat softly. "Your mother just means is..." "No," I interrupted calmly. "I know exactly what she means." That shut him down immediately. The waiter passed nearby carrying a flaming dessert toward another table, while soft laughter echoed through the restaurant. Somewhere behind me, somebody celebrated a birthday. Meanwhile, my own family sat there, conducting a financial ambush with the emotional warmth of a board meeting. Margaret still wore that polished country club smile. The scary thing about people like my mother is they never think they're cruel. Cruel people usually imagine themselves yelling or throwing things. Margaret believed cruelty delivered politely somehow stopped being cruelty. She genuinely thought this was reasonable. That's what made it ugly. Julian tapped the edge of the receipt. "You've been stacking government money tax-free for 9 months, he said. "Relax, it's one dinner, $5,000 for seafood and fake status." I thought about the junior enlisted guys overseas who sent half their deployment checks home every month so their wives' zapas could afford groceries. I thought about a 22-year-old specialist named Morales who slept on a folding cot for 6 weeks because incoming rocket damage wiped out his housing unit. Meanwhile, my brother was inhaling imported crab legs under chandelier lighting while calling military deployment free money. Margaret's tone softened even more. "We're proud of your service, Elena." That sentence almost made it worse, because it sounded so practiced, so performative, like something printed inside a political campaign brochure. She reached across the table and patted my wrist gently for the first time all night. "You take care of this," she said quietly, "and we'll finally have a nice evening together." I looked down at her hand resting on my sleeve, then at the receipt, then around the table. And for the first time since walking into that restaurant, I stopped feeling lonely. Lonely implied misunderstanding. This wasn't misunderstanding anymore. This was intentional. Their cruelty came wrapped in smiles, polished silverware, and fake affection so smooth it almost looked normal from a distance. Almost. I lifted my mother's hand off my wrist and placed it gently back onto the tablecloth. Nobody spoke for a few seconds after that. The restaurant noise kept moving around us like normal life had decided not to get involved. Glasses clinked. A waiter laughed quietly near the bar, Somebody behind me asked for extra lemon with their oysters. At our table, though, the temperature changed. Margaret's smile stayed frozen in place, but I could already see irritation building underneath it. She wasn't used to pauses. People usually rushed to fill silence around her before she had to acknowledge discomfort. Julian leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "So what's the issue?" he asked. "Just throw it on your Amex." The confidence in his voice almost impressed me. That level of entitlement required years of uninterrupted reinforcement. I looked down at the leather receipt folder one more time before closing it carefully. Then I folded my linen napkin, slowly, corner to corner, perfect square. Military habits are funny like that. People think training only shows up during emergencies. Truth is, training appears when your nervous system recognizes danger before your emotions do. And right then, sitting under chandelier lighting across from my own family, my brain understood something important. Do not react emotionally in a room full of people waiting to use your emotions against you. Margaret sighed dramatically. "Elena, sweetheart, nobody's attacking you." That word again. Sweetheart, weaponized affection in designer clothing. I placed the folded napkin beside my plate and finally looked directly at all three of them. "I can't pay this tonight." Arthur blinked first. Julian laughed once under his breath like I'd made a joke. Margaret smiled tighter. "Oh, stop," she said. "You're being difficult. I'm being accurate." That landed harder than I expected, because accuracy ruins manipulation faster than anger does. Julian leaned forward. "What, your card suddenly stopped working?" "Yes." He rolled his eyes immediately. "Come on." I kept my voice calm. At 0800 this morning, Defense Finance and Accounting Service flagged an overseas routing anomaly tied to one of my deployment transfers. Arthur frowned slightly. He knew enough about military bureaucracy to recognize the language. Margaret did not. She just looked annoyed. "What does that even mean?" "It means my primary accounts are under mandatory federal security freeze until the audit clears." The table went quiet. Not dramatic movie quiet. Real quiet. Confused quiet. I could practically hear my mother's brain trying to reorganize reality into a version she preferred. Julian scoffed. "For how long?" "Minimum 72 hours. I watched the information hit them in stages. First disbelief, then calculation, then panic. Margaret's face changed color almost immediately. Not pale exactly. More like the blood quietly evacuated her expression all at once. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Call somebody." "I already did." "Well, call again. That won't change federal processing timelines." Julian shook his head impatiently. "No offense, Elena, but this sounds fake." I almost smiled. "No offense, Julian, but federal finance systems don't ask for your opinion." Arthur finally spoke. "What kind of routing issue?" "Contractor-side verification mismatch connected to overseas transfer authentication." He nodded. Slowly, like a man, hearing terms he didn't fully understand but respected enough not to challenge. Margaret did not share that instinct. "This is unbelievable," she hissed. "You're seriously telling me you can't access your own money?" "Correct." "But you're an officer." "Yes, so fix it." I stared at her for a second. There it was again. That assumption that competence existed solely for their convenience. Like my career was some magical customer service hotline they could call whenever consequences appeared. I already explained the situation. Margaret's voice lowered sharply. "Elena, don't embarrass us." Interesting sentence. Not "how do we solve this?" Not "are you okay?" Not even "what happens now?" Her first concern was social appearance. The Vance family religion. Julian grabbed the leather folio and flipped it open aggressively. $5,000 isn't even that crazy," he muttered. "Just move money around." I almost admired the stupidity. People who never manage real money always think money magically teleports between accounts because apps have animations now. "Military fraud prevention systems don't work like Venmo," I said. Arthur rubbed his forehead slowly. "When did this happen?" "About 6 hours before my flight boarded in Frankfurt." "That's insane. Welcome to government accounting." Julian tried laughing again, but it came out thinner this time. "You're telling me the U.S. Army froze your accounts on the exact day we go to dinner?" "The Defense Finance and Accounting Service froze my accounts," I corrected. "And yes." Margaret stared at me like I had personally engineered the situation to inconvenience her. Which, honestly, was ironic, considering they had absolutely engineered this dinner to exploit me financially. A waiter passed by and asked softly if we wanted dessert menus. Nobody answered him. Poor guy walked straight into emotional artillery fire without body armor. Margaret lowered her voice even further. "You couldn't have mentioned this earlier?" I looked around the table slowly. At what point? Nobody answered, because there hadn't actually been a point. Nobody asked me a single financial question before ordering half the North Pacific. Nobody checked whether I agreed to cover dinner. They simply assumed. That was the whole business model. Julian leaned back again, but the confidence was gone now. You seriously don't have access to anything? Not my primary accounts? What about savings, frozen, credit? Extracted during review. Margaret looked horrified. You're kidding. No. Another long silence settled over the table. This one felt heavier. The kind where reality finally enters the room and starts charging people rent. I could almost see my mother mentally replaying every order from the night. Every champagne bottle, every seafood tower, every smug little assumption. $5,318.45 suddenly became very real. And for the first time all evening, nobody at the table looked important anymore. They looked trapped. The math of their betrayal had depended on one critical assumption, that I would always be available to absorb the cost. Tonight, federal accounting software accidentally destroyed their entire business strategy. Julian snatched his wallet out so fast he nearly knocked over a champagne flute. There, he said sharply, pulling out a metallic black credit card like he was ending the conversation by force. Problem solved. The confidence sounded fake now, not completely fake. Just expensive guy at a casino fake. He slid the card into the leather folio and handed it toward the waiter with a tight smile that screamed performative control. Run it. The waiter nodded professionally and disappeared toward the payment terminal near the back bar. Nobody spoke while we waited. Margaret adjusted the sleeve of her blazer 3 separate times in under 30 seconds. Arthur kept rubbing one thumb against the edge of his whiskey glass, like he was trying to sand reality down into something manageable. I sat quietly. That seemed to bother them more than anything else. People expecting guilt from you get deeply uncomfortable when you stay calm. Julian finally looked at me. You really should have warned us earlier. Interesting rewrite of history. Not we shouldn't have assumed. Not we shouldn't have ordered $5,000 in seafood. Just blame redistribution. I did warn you, I said, when I said I couldn't pay. Margaret exhaled sharply through her nose. Oh, please, Elena, don't do that military robot thing right now. Military robot thing. That was new. Apparently, emotional discipline became offensive the second it stopped benefiting them. 3 minutes later, the waiter returned, and I knew before he even reached the table. Restaurant staff develop a special walk for declined cards, slightly slower, slightly softer, like somebody approaching a dog that might bite. He leaned toward Julian discreetly. I'm very sorry, sir. Julian's jaw tightened immediately. The waiter lowered his voice further. It appears the transaction was declined. Silence. Real silence this time. The nearby piano music suddenly sounded louder. Margaret blinked. What? Julian grabbed the folio quickly. That's impossible. The waiter maintained perfect professional calm. You're welcome to try another form of payment. Julian stared down at the receipt like it personally betrayed him. Then he laughed once. Too loudly. Oh my God. Fraud protection. Hold on. He pulled out his phone immediately and started tapping aggressively at the screen. I caught a glimpse of multiple banking notifications stacked together before he angled it away. Interesting. Very interesting. Margaret leaned toward him urgently. What happened? Nothing happened. That card should work. It usually does. Usually, there was a dangerous word. Arthur slowly sat back in his chair, and I watched the first visible crack appear in his expression all night. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Fear. The quiet middle-aged American fear of realizing the numbers are worse than everybody pretended. Julian tried another card, then another. The waiter returned again around 9:58 p.m., carrying the same careful expression funeral directors probably practice in mirrors. I apologize, sir. That was all he needed to say. Margaret's breathing changed immediately. Shorter. Faster. Oh my God, she whispered. She opened her designer purse so violently a lipstick rolled onto the tablecloth beside the butter dishes. There's another one in here somewhere. Julian muttered under his breath while refreshing his banking app over and over. Arthur stared straight upward toward the chandelier like a man mentally calculating how expensive prison lawyers were. Honestly, the whole thing would have been sad if they hadn't spent the last 4 hours treating me like a walking reimbursement department. Margaret finally pulled out another card with trembling fingers. This one has plenty of room. That sentence told me everything. People with real money never say, plenty of room. The waiter took the card politely. She forced a smile toward nearby tables like everything remained perfectly under control. Nobody believed it anymore. A woman at the next table had fully stopped pretending not to listen. Seattle rich people loved public humiliation as long as it happened quietly. Julian lowered his voice toward me. You couldn't maybe call your bank again? DFAS isn't a local credit union. Jesus Christ, Elena. No, I said calmly. Jesus Christ didn't order 12 pounds of king crab. Arthur actually made a choking sound, trying not to laugh. Margaret shot him a furious look. The waiter returned again. Third decline. At that point, even the pianist seemed uncomfortable. Margaret pressed her fingers against her forehead. That's not possible, she whispered. But I could tell by her face she already knew it was possible. Maxed cards have a specific emotional energy around them. People carrying that kind of debt, they always react too quickly when payment conversations start happening unexpectedly. Julian stood up halfway from his chair. This is insane. The waiter kept his tone respectful. Would you like a few additional minutes? Margaret snapped instantly. No, said another voice. A man in a charcoal suit approached the table from behind the waiter. General manager, probably mid-50s, silver tie, calm posture. The facial expression of someone who'd spent 20 years professionally dealing with rich people becoming poor for 15 minutes at a time. Good evening, he said smoothly. I'm Daniel Mercer, the general manager. Nobody introduced themselves. Mercer glanced once at the unpaid folio before looking directly at the table. I understand we're having some difficulty processing payment tonight. Margaret immediately activated her country club voice. Oh, it's just a banking misunderstanding. Of course, Mercer said politely. Unfortunately, we do require a valid payment method before closing the evening. Julian straightened up aggressively. You seriously think we'd walk out on this? Mercer didn't flinch. I'm sure nobody intends to create a misunderstanding, sir. That was manager language for, I absolutely think you might walk out on this. Margaret tried smiling again. My daughter usually handles family dinners. I watched Mercer's eyes shift toward me for the first time. Just one look, army jacket, one sparkling water, untouched seafood. Smart guy figured it out immediately. And are you responsible for the balance this evening, Mom? He asked calmly. Before tonight, I probably would have rescued them automatically. That's the dangerous thing about being the reliable person in dysfunctional families. You get trained like a service animal. Solve, cover, absorb, repair. But something had changed the second my mother slid that receipt toward me like I existed solely to finance their illusion of status. I looked directly at the manager. No, I said evenly, I'm not. And just like that, the entire performance collapsed. They had ordered an ocean they couldn't swim in. Now everybody at the table was finally drowning in it. The manager kept his eyes on me after I said no. Not aggressive. Not suspicious, just attentive. Like he'd finally identified the only adult at the table. Margaret turned toward me so fast her chair scraped the floor. Elena. That tone carried years of expectation inside it. The fix-it tone. The clean up your brother's mess tone. The don't make this public tone. I ignored it. Daniel Mercer stood calmly beside the table, with his hands folded in front of him while the unpaid receipt sat there between us, like unexploded ordnance. Julian ran both hands through his hair. This is getting ridiculous. No, I said quietly. This got ridiculous around the second champagne bottle. He glared at me. Arthur finally looked directly at me for the first time in nearly an hour. Keto, he said, carefully. Maybe there's another account somewhere. That almost hurt more than everything else. Not because he asked. Because even now, after watching this entire situation unfold, his instinct was still search for a way to make me absorb the consequences instead of asking why they built the trap in the first place. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my jacket slowly. Margaret visibly relaxed. There it was, hope. She thought I'd finally surrendered. Probably imagined I was reaching for an emergency card or military credit line. Maybe she pictured herself laughing about this disaster later over brunch with her friends. Oh, thank God, she muttered. Instead, I pulled out exactly $45 in crisp cash. $2.20. 1.5. I placed the bills neatly beside the leather folio. The manager glanced down automatically. So we're covered, Julian said immediately. No, I replied. I slid the money slightly forward. That covers my side salad, sparkling water, and estimated tax. Silence. Absolute silence. Even nearby tables had started openly watching by then. Margaret stared at the cash like I'd placed a dead animal on the tablecloth. Elena, she whispered sharply. What are you doing? Paying for what I ordered. That's insane. No. What's insane is ordering over $5,000 in seafood, assuming somebody else would quietly finance your evening. Julian leaned forward aggressively. You're seriously making a scene over this? I almost laughed at the irony. People who create disasters always accuse others of making a scene when cleanup gets denied. Daniel Mercer spoke carefully. Mom, just to clarify, are you stating you're financially separate from the remainder of the party? Yes. Margaret's face tightened instantly. She doesn't mean that. I looked directly at the manager. Yes, I do. The room suddenly felt smaller. Not physically, socially. The illusion of family unity had evaporated, and now everybody could see the wiring underneath. Arthur rubbed both hands over his face. Alina, come on. No, one word, flat, simple. Military briefings teach you something useful. The calmer your voice becomes, the more seriously people listen. I looked directly at Mercer. I did not authorize these purchases. I did not participate in ordering these items. I did not agree to guarantee payment for the individuals seated to my left. Margaret looked horrified. Individuals? I ignored her. I ordered one-side salads at 7:31 p.m. and one sparkling water. Mercer nodded once. Professional, measured. I understand. Julian scoffed loudly. Oh my God, listen to yourself. You sound like a lawyer. No, I said calmly. I sound like somebody documenting liability. That shut him up for exactly 3 seconds. Your family. Interesting timing for that word. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Her voice sharpened hard enough that 2 nearby tables immediately stopped pretending not to eavesdrop. A good daughter does not humiliate her family over a dinner bill. I looked at her for a long moment, then at the seafood towers, then at the champagne bottles, then at the empty caviar tray sitting between us like physical evidence. You humiliated yourselves before I got here. That landed. Hard. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Julian muttered, Jesus Christ. But nobody denied it, because they couldn't. The truth was sitting all over the table in melted ice and empty shells. Mercer cleared his throat gently. We can certainly allow a little additional time to resolve payment arrangements. Margaret immediately latched onto that sentence like a life raft. Yes, exactly. There's no need to escalate. Julian stood again and grabbed his phone. I'll move some money around. He walked several feet away toward the bar area pretending confidence, but I watched his shoulders tighten while he spoke quietly to someone on speakerphone. Probably a bank. Possibly a creditor. Definitely not an investor. Margaret leaned closer toward me again, lowering her voice into that poisonous, fake tenderness she used whenever manipulation needed softer packaging. You're being vindictive. No, I said. I'm being separate. There's a difference? Yes. Vindictive people create traps. Separate people refuse to step into them. Her expression changed after that. Something uglier surfaced underneath the polished exterior. Not rage exactly. Resentment. The resentment people feel when their favorite source of control suddenly develops boundaries. Arthur looked exhausted. Alina, nobody meant for this to happen. I nodded once. That's the problem. He frowned. You all expected it to happen. Another silence. Mercer stayed perfectly still beside the table, but I could tell he understood the entire family dynamic by now. Restaurant managers probably develop psychological profiling skills the same way ER nurses do. Julian returned looking pale. Transfer limits, he muttered. Of course. Margaret whispered something furious under her breath, and sitting there, watching all of them unravel, I realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. Anger requires emotional investment. This felt different. Cleaner, like finally seeing a building clearly after somebody removes the fog around it. My entire life, they trained me to believe love meant financial usefulness, reliability, endurance, sacrifice without limits. Tonight was the first time I truly understood something important. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are instructions. And mine had finally become impossible to misunderstand. Steel doesn't need to scream to be strong. Julian sat back down hard enough to rattle the silverware. His face looked different now. Smaller somehow. The smug startup founder energy had completely evaporated, replaced by the expression of a man realizing confidence could not be used as legal tender. Margaret kept whispering furious little curses under her breath while digging through her purse again like a maxed-out credit card might magically regenerate if she searched aggressively enough. Arthur looked the oldest I'd ever seen him. Not physically, spiritually. The manager remained calm beside the table, but the patients in the room had started developing edges. You understand our position, Mercer said carefully. At this point, we simply need confirmation that payment will be resolved tonight. Tonight, not eventually, not after fake investors arrived, not after fantasy transfers cleared. Tonight. Arthur swallowed hard. How long before this becomes official? Mercer chose his words with professional precision. If no valid payment method can be produced, restaurant policy requires escalation. Nobody said the word police. They didn't need to. Margaret's breathing picked up again immediately. This is insane, she whispered. Over dinner? Mercer gave her a polite nod. Over $5,318.45, Mom. Hearing the total out loud changed the atmosphere again. Numbers become heavier once spoken publicly. Julian rubbed both hands over his face. Dad, do something. Arthur blinked like he'd just been shaken awake. What exactly do you expect me to do? I don't know. Talk to her. There it was, finally. The official surrender. Not apology, not accountability, just desperation. Arthur slowly turned toward me, and for a second I saw the version of my father I remembered from childhood. The tired man who taught me how to change a tire in a grocery store parking lot when I was 16. The guy who used to leave notes in my lunchbox before high school field trips. That version still existed somewhere underneath decades of avoidance. Elena, he said quietly. I looked at him. Please. One word, soft, almost ashamed. Margaret immediately jumped in. She has military emergency credit lines. Interesting. Not maybe, not if. She knew exactly what benefits I had. Of course she did. My mother treated my military career the way gamblers study horse racing statistics. Arthur leaned closer. Kiddo, just help us get through tonight. We'll figure everything out later. Another dangerous word. Families like mine survive on later. Later becomes next month. Next month becomes never. I looked at him calmly. You mean I pay for it? No, he said too quickly. No, that's not what I mean. It's exactly what you mean. Margaret's voice sharpened instantly. For God's sake, Elena, stop acting like we're criminals. I glanced at the table. 5 empty champagne bottles, destroyed seafood towers, declined cards. A panicked son, pretending bankruptcy was a networking strategy. Honestly, the optics weren't helping them. Julian pointed toward me aggressively. You're really going to let this happen? I almost asked him the same thing. You're really going to let your mother pressure your deployed sister into financing your fake luxury lifestyle? But I was too tired for another circular conversation. Mercer remained perfectly still, professional enough not to interrupt, experienced enough to know families reveal their true structure under financial pressure. Margaret lowered her voice into a furious whisper. A good daughter would never leave her mother sitting here like this. There it was again. Family duty, always weaponized downward. Funny how responsibility in our family only traveled toward the person least likely to create the problem. I looked at my mother carefully, her makeup still flawless, jewelry still sparkling under restaurant lighting. But the mask had slipped now. This wasn't about humiliation. This wasn't about family. This was about losing access to control. You were willing to charge $5,000 to me without asking, I said quietly. That's not what happened. It's exactly what happened. We assumed. Yes, I interrupted softly. You did. Arthur rubbed his forehead again. Elena, nobody thought it would go this far. That sentence sat with me for a second. Because it was probably true. They genuinely never imagined resistance. People get addicted to reliable rescuers. After enough years, they stop seeing rescue as kindness and start treating it like infrastructure. I looked around the table slowly, at the ruined seafood, at the half-melted ice, at the panic sweating through Julian's confidence, at my father shrinking deeper into himself, at my mother still trying to manipulate morality into a financial instrument. And suddenly, I didn't feel angry at all. That surprised me most. I should have been furious. Instead, I felt tired. Not physically, soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing the people who claim to love you only feel safe when you're useful. Julian spoke again, quieter this time. You'd really let them call the cops on us? I looked directly at him. You ordered food you couldn't pay for. You could stop this. So could you? Nobody spoke after that. Because there was nothing left to hide behind anymore. Not family, not pride, not fake success. Just consequences sitting at the table collecting interest. Margaret's eyes suddenly filled with tears. Real tears this time. But even then, I couldn't fully trust them. My mother cried the way some people use punctuation. Elena, she whispered, how can you be this cold? That question almost made me laugh. Cold? I spent 9 months helping move emergency medical supplies through active military zones so strangers I'd never meet could stay alive. I sent money home every Christmas. Paid for Arthur's dental surgery 3 years ago. Covered Julian's temporary setback rent during the pandemic. But tonight, the first time I refused to finance disrespect, suddenly I was cold. That's when I finally understood something clearly enough to say out loud. I looked directly at all three of them. My voice stayed calm, almost gentle. I cannot afford your kind of love. Nobody moved after that, not even Margaret. Because deep down, they all understood exactly what I meant. Their version of love always came with an invoice attached. I pushed my chair back slowly before anybody could say another word. The sound of the wooden legs scraping against the floor seemed louder than the piano now. Nobody tried to stop me immediately. I think they were still stunned by the sentence hanging over the table. I cannot afford your kind of love. Funny thing is, once you finally tell the truth out loud, the room changes permanently. People can argue with anger. They can fight accusations. They can survive yelling, but truth just sits there, heavy, unmovable. Margaret stared at me with watery eyes and disbelief mixed together like she genuinely could not process a reality where I refused to rescue her. Julian looked furious in that helpless way spoiled people get when consequences stop behaving like customer service employees. Arthur just looked tired. Older than 62, older than I'd ever seen him. Daniel Mercer stepped slightly aside as I stood up and reached for my duffel bag beside the chair. Elena, Arthur said quietly. I paused. Not because he deserved it, because some part of me still remembered being 8 years old and falling asleep on his shoulder during road trips. You're really leaving? I looked at him for a second. You all left me a long time ago. Nobody had a response for that one. Margaret finally snapped. So that's it, she hissed. You're just abandoning your family? The word abandoning almost made me laugh. I spent most of my adult life carrying them emotionally, financially, and mentally like unpaid second employment. Apparently refusing one bill now qualified as abandonment. No, I said calmly while slipping my jacket back on. I'm separating myself from a situation I didn't create. Julian scoffed. You're unbelievable. That one actually earned a smile from me. No, I said. I just stopped being predictable. That hit him harder than shouting would, because he knew it was true. Predictability had been the foundation of the whole system. Elena works hard. Elena stays calm. Elena fixes problems. Elena pays eventually. Tonight, the machine malfunctioned. Mercer cleared his throat carefully. Mom, he said to Margaret, I do need to ask how you intend to resolve the remaining balance. Margaret looked physically offended that the world kept continuing without her permission. We are handling it. Mercer gave a polite nod that clearly meant you are absolutely not handling it. Julian started typing furiously on his phone again, probably texting friends, or creditors, maybe both. Arthur stood halfway like he wanted to follow me, but didn't fully commit. That was the story of his entire life in one movement, halfway. I'll call you tomorrow, he said weakly. I adjusted the strap on my duffel bag. No, you won't. His face fell because he knew I was right. Not because he didn't care, because avoidance had become his native language years ago. Margaret suddenly lowered her voice again. If police walk in here over this, she whispered, horrified. I looked around the table one last time. At the destroyed seafood towers, at the empty champagne bottles, at the panic soaked into expensive clothing. And honestly, I didn't feel satisfaction. That surprised me. Movies always lie about revenge. They make it look exciting, victorious, cathartic. Real life usually feels quieter than that, more disappointing. Like finally accepting somebody you loved was emotionally smaller than you hoped. I reached into my pocket and placed my parking ticket on the table beside the $45. The valet closes at midnight, I told Arthur automatically. Even then, still helping a little, old habits die slow. Then I turned and walked away from the table. Nobody followed me. The heavy glass doors of Le Marin opened with a soft hydraulic hiss, and cold Seattle air hit my face instantly. Rain had stopped sometime during the chaos inside, leaving the streets wet and shining under traffic lights. The city smelled like saltwater, wet concrete, and diesel from the harbor. For the first time all night, I could breathe normally. Behind me, through the restaurant windows, I could still see blurred movement around the table. Julian pacing now, Margaret talking rapidly with her hands. Mercer standing perfectly still beside them, like a man supervising a controlled demolition. A distant siren echoed somewhere near the waterfront. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just city noise. But Margaret heard it too. I glanced back once and saw pure panic cross her face. That was the moment I almost felt sorry enough to return. Almost. Then I remembered something from overseas. During deployment, one of our senior warrant officers used to say that panic spreads fastest when people spend too long believing consequences are optional. At the time, he was talking about logistics failures. Turns out, it applied to families too. I started walking toward the waterfront with my hands in my jacket pockets while cold wind rolled off Elliott Bay. My boots hit the wet pavements steadily, the same rhythm I'd kept crossing airfields overseas at 4 in the morning carrying manifests and radio updates. Only now there were no alarms, no generators, no incoming alerts, just rainwater dripping from neon signs and ferries moving slowly through the dark harbor. I realized something important while passing a closed coffee shop near Pine Street. All night, my family kept acting like dignity was something given to you by other people, by parents, by money, by a seat at the right table. But dignity doesn't work like that. Real dignity is expensive, not financially, emotionally, because sometimes it costs the relationships you spent years trying to keep alive. I stopped near the harbor railing and looked out across the black water while waves hit the pilings below. 9 months overseas taught me how to survive hostile environments. Tonight finally taught me something harder. You can love people deeply and still refuse to let them consume you. The wind pulled at my jacket while another siren echoed faintly somewhere behind the city blocks. I never looked back again. Some people spend their whole lives begging for a seat at tables that were designed to humiliate them. I was finally done auditioning for mine. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly where North was. I didn't sleep much the first week after the restaurant. Not because I regretted leaving. Because once your brain finally stops surviving something, it starts reviewing it. I went back to my apartment near Joint Base Lewis McChord 2 days later after the DFAS freeze finally cleared. Rain hit the windows almost every morning that week, and I remember sitting at my kitchen counter at 5:30 a.m. drinking terrible instant coffee while replaying that dinner in my head over and over again. Not the screaming, not the bill, not even the humiliation. The part that stayed with me was realizing how normal everything had felt until it suddenly didn't. That's the dangerous thing about unhealthy family dynamics. They rarely begin with one giant moment. They grow quietly through repetition. One favor, one guilt trip, one, you're better with money than us, one, don't make this a big deal, one, family helps family. After enough years, you stop noticing the pattern because the pattern becomes your personality. I think a lot of responsible people understand exactly what I mean. If you're the dependable one in your family, people slowly start treating your stability like community property. Your time becomes available. Your savings become flexible. Your emotional energy becomes public infrastructure. And the worst part? You start feeling guilty for wanting limits. That dinner forced me to admit something I'd avoided for years. I had confused usefulness with love. I thought being needed meant being valued. Those are not the same thing. Not even close. Back when I was stationed in Texas, before my deployment overseas, Julian called me one night around 11:40 p.m., saying he was temporarily short on rent after some business issue. I wired him $2,800 without asking questions because I genuinely believed helping family meant acting first and thinking later. 3 months after that, Margaret called me selfish for missing Easter brunch because I had field exercises scheduled on base. That should have been the moment I noticed the imbalance. It wasn't. Then Arthur needed dental surgery insurance wouldn't fully cover. I paid part of it. No resentment. I'd do that again honestly. He was my father. But afterward, something strange happened. Nobody treated those sacrifices like acts of generosity. They treated them like evidence of availability. That changes people. Once somebody becomes accustomed to your sacrifice, gratitude slowly disappears and expectation replaces it. And expectation is where relationships quietly start turning transactional. That's why the restaurant hurt more than the money itself. It exposed the entire structure in one night. My family didn't see me as Elena first anymore. I was the responsible one, the stable one, the financially safe one. Basically an emotional support ATM wearing combat boots. And before anybody listening misunderstands me, let me say this. Helping family, not weakness. Generosity is not stupidity. The problem starts when support only moves in one direction. Healthy families appreciate sacrifice. Unhealthy families budget around it. That's the difference. I also learned something uncomfortable about manipulation that night. Manipulative people rarely sound cruel. If my mother had screamed, insulted me, or demanded money aggressively from the start, the situation would have been obvious. Most emotionally manipulative behavior doesn't look like that. It sounds polished, reasonable, even loving. A good daughter helps. Don't embarrass us. Family takes care of each other. People hear those phrases and automatically assume morality is involved. Sometimes it's just pressure wearing polite clothing. And look, I understand some viewers probably think I should pay the bill anyway to avoid the scene. Honestly, old me probably would have. That's what took me so long to process afterward. Hardest part about boundaries is that they feel cruel the first time you enforce them. Especially if you were raised inside dynamics where your value depended on how much discomfort you could absorb quietly. For years, I honestly believed being low maintenance made me lovable. It doesn't. It makes you convenient. There's a difference. One thing military service taught me is that systems fail when pressure only flows one direction. Eventually, something breaks. Equipment breaks. People break. Relationships break. Families are no different. If one person is constantly sacrificing while everybody else consumes, collapse is just a matter of timing. That night happened to be ours. And weirdly enough, I don't even hate my family for it anymore. I think that surprises people. Hatred requires emotional energy I no longer want to donate. What I feel now is clearer than anger. I understand them. That's different. Margaret built her entire identity around appearances and status. Julian built his around avoiding failure long enough to keep pretending success was right around the corner. Arthur's spent decades surviving conflict by staying passive until passivity became his personality. And me? I built mine around being useful. Every family has roles. The problem starts when nobody is allowed to outgrow theirs. So if you're watching this story and constantly feeling emotionally drained around certain relatives, pay attention to patterns instead of words. Pay attention to how people react when you say no. Pay attention to whether love disappears the moment money, favors, or emotional labor stop flowing. And most importantly, stop believing boundaries make you selfish. Sometimes boundaries are the first honest thing you've ever done. The restaurant bill was never really about seafood. It was about what happens when one person finally decides their peace matters too. I started changing small things first, not dramatic things. Not movie-style life transformations where somebody deletes every contact in their phone and moves to a cabin in Montana after a breakthrough moment. Real change usually looks a lot more boring than that. About 3 weeks after the restaurant incident, Margaret called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in line at a pharmacy picking up allergy medication. First thing out of her mouth wasn't, "How are you?" It was, "Your brother is going through a hard time." Of course he was. Julian was always going through a hard time right after expensive decisions. Old me would have immediately asked what happened, how much he needed, whether there was some emergency I needed to solve before it spread. Instead, I said something simple. "I hope he figures it out." Then I stayed quiet. That silence changed my life more than any argument ever did, because people reveal a lot once they realize automatic access to you no longer exists. Margaret got cold immediately. "Well, I guess military life really changed you." That line used to work on me. Not anymore. I think a lot of people watching this story need to understand something important. Boundaries are not giant emotional speeches. They're patterns. Tiny repeated decisions. Not answering guilt immediately. Not explaining yourself for 45 minutes every time you say no. Not offering solutions to problems adults created on purpose. That's what boundaries actually look like in real life. And honestly, the hardest part is not saying no to strangers. It's saying no to people who trained you to feel guilty for having limits. After the restaurant, I made a rule for myself. No more emergency financial rescues without documentation, accountability, or repayment plans. You would have thought I announced I was joining a criminal organization. The reactions were incredible. Suddenly, I was different, distant, too serious. Funny how responsible people become cold the second they stop being convenient. I also stopped discussing money with family completely. That one changed everything fast. People can't emotionally budget around your income if they no longer know your financial situation. Before that dinner, Margaret knew my deployment pay schedule better than some finance officers on base. She asked casual questions constantly. How much extra do officers make overseas? Do you still get housing allowance while deployed? Your savings must look amazing after 9 months. At the time, I thought she was showing interest in my life. Nope. She was conducting market research, so I stopped volunteering information. And let me tell you something uncomfortable. The less access certain people have to your resources, the less interested they suddenly become in your emotional well-being. That realization hurts. But it also clarifies everything. One of the biggest mistakes responsible people make is assuming repeated emergencies are always accidental. Sometimes they are. Life happens, medical bills happen, layoffs happen, bad luck happens. But if the same person creates chaos every 6 months while expecting rescue every single time, eventually you have to stop calling it bad luck and start calling it a lifestyle. Julian never learned financial discipline because nobody ever allowed consequences to educate him long enough. Somebody always stepped in, usually me, and before anybody misunderstands what I'm saying, helping people you love is not weakness. The problem is helping somebody repeatedly while their behavior never changes. Support without accountability eventually becomes permission. That applies to family too. Another thing nobody warns you about? The emotional withdrawal symptoms after setting boundaries. That part surprised me most. For the first month after the restaurant, I felt weirdly anxious all the time, like I forgot to complete some important task. My nervous system had spent years staying hyper alert for family problems, financial emergencies, emotional landmines, sudden guilt trips. When those patterns stopped, silence almost felt unsafe. That's how normalized dysfunction becomes. Peace feels suspicious at first. I remember sitting in my apartment one Saturday morning around 9:20 a.m., realizing nobody had texted me asking for anything in almost 2 weeks. No favors. No money. No emotional cleanup work. Just silence. And instead of enjoying it immediately, I felt guilty. That's when I realized how deep the conditioning actually went. A therapist told me something later that stuck hard. She said, "When people are used to unlimited access to you, boundaries feel like punishment to them." That explained almost every reaction my family had after the dinner. To me, I was finally behaving normally. To them, I had suddenly become unavailable infrastructure. And look, I know some viewers probably come from cultures or families where saying no feels impossible. I understand that completely. Family loyalty matters to me too. But loyalty without respect eventually turns into self-erasure. That's the danger. If every relationship in your life requires you to stay exhausted in order to keep peace, eventually your entire personality becomes maintenance work. That's not love. That's emotional debt collection. The biggest lesson I can give anybody watching this is simple. Pay attention to how people react when you stop overextending yourself. Healthy people adjust. Manipulative people escalate. Healthy people respect your limits even when disappointed. Manipulative people immediately attack your character the second access changes. And please hear me clearly when I say this. Feeling guilty does not automatically mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt is just old programming. Sometimes it's the emotional hangover that comes after finally protecting yourself. I still love my family in some complicated human way. But love cannot survive long-term inside systems where one person is expected to sacrifice endlessly while everybody else calls it normal. Eventually, somebody has to break the pattern. In my family, that person ended up being me. And honestly, I should have done it years earlier. About 4 months after the restaurant incident, I got a voicemail from Arthur at 6:14 on a Sunday morning, not a dramatic voicemail. No crying, no emergency. Just his tired voice saying, "Hey kiddo, just checking in. Hope you're doing okay." That was it. I listened to it twice while standing in my kitchen making eggs before PT. Then I deleted it. Not out of anger, out of clarity. That's the part people struggle to understand once you finally stop participating in unhealthy dynamics. They assume every boundary comes from rage. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you're simply done reopening wounds that took years to close. Life got quieter after the restaurant, really quiet. At first, I thought something was wrong because my phone stopped buzzing constantly. No random financial crises, no manipulative family discussions, no guilt-loaded messages disguised as concern. Just space. And honestly, space can feel terrifying when chaos has been your normal environment for years. The first Christmas after everything happened felt especially strange. I stayed on base instead of flying home to Seattle. A few other officers and enlisted personnel who didn't travel that year ended up throwing together this weird, unofficial holiday dinner in one of the housing common rooms. Paper plates. Store-bought cookies. Somebody burned the ham slightly. It was probably the least impressive Christmas dinner I'd had in years. and somehow it felt more peaceful than sitting at a luxury seafood restaurant under chandeliers with my actual family. Nobody at that table wanted anything from me except conversation. That realization hit hard. I think people underestimate how exhausting it is to constantly exist around transactional relationships. Even when nobody openly asks for money, emotional manipulation still drains you. You start measuring every interaction carefully. Is this a real conversation? Or are we slowly driving toward a request? That hyper-awareness changed people over time. You become cautious in places where you should feel safe. That's no way to live. Around January, Margaret finally texted me directly for the first time since the restaurant. Not an apology. Of course not. It said, "I hope one day you realize how much you hurt this family." I stared at that message for a long time. Years ago, it would destroyed me emotionally. I would immediately started defending myself, explaining my side, apologizing for upsetting everyone even if I knew I wasn't wrong. This time, I just looked at it calmly. Then I put my phone down and went to the gym. Growth sometimes looks incredibly boring from the outside. No dramatic speech, no revenge monologue, just somebody deciding not to re-enter the same emotional trap again. That's all. One thing I learned after walking away is that forgiveness and reconciliation are completely different things. A lot of people confuse them. Forgiveness is internal, reconciliation is access. You can stop hating somebody without reopening the door they used to hurt you. That distinction changed my life. I don't spend my days angry at my family anymore. Honestly, anger takes too much energy. Military life already burns enough emotional fuel without dragging old resentment behind you like a trailer. But I also stopped fantasizing about who they might become someday. That part matters. A lot of people stay trapped in unhealthy relationships because they keep loving potential instead of reality. Maybe this time they'll change. Maybe this time they'll understand. Maybe this time they'll finally appreciate me. Maybe this time the conversation will be different. Meanwhile, years disappear. Sometimes maturity means accepting people exactly as they are instead of exhausting yourself trying to earn healthier behavior from them. That lesson hurt, but it also freed me. Julian actually reached out once too, 3 months after the dinner. He sent me this long message about how hard business had become and how stress made everyone act irrationally that night. There were 6 paragraphs explaining his pressure, his anxiety, his financial situation. Not one actual apology in the entire thing. That told me everything I needed to know. Accountability sounds very different from explanation. People who are truly sorry talk about the damage they caused. People avoiding responsibility mostly talk about themselves. I never answered him, not because I hated him, because silence was finally healthier than another cycle. And look, I know some viewers listening to this probably still think family should always come first no matter what. I understand why people feel that way, but I want to say something carefully here. Love without respect eventually becomes emotional survival work, and survival is not the same thing as connection. You should not have to destroy your peace to prove your loyalty to people. You should not have to stay financially or emotionally available 24 hours a day just to avoid being called selfish. And you definitely should not have to earn basic decencies through sacrifice. Real relationships do not collapse the moment boundaries appear. Only unhealthy ones do. These days, my life is smaller in some ways. Quieter, more private. I spend more time with people who ask how I'm doing before they ask what I can provide. That changed everything. Turns out peace is not exciting. Peace is eating dinner without tension in your chest. Peace is answering your phone without anxiety. Peace is realizing your worth exists even on days when you are not rescuing anyone. And honestly, that's worth more than every champagne bottle at Le Marin combined. If you stayed through this entire story, thank you. Seriously. And if any part of this reminded you of your own family, your own exhaustion, or your own struggle with boundaries, I hope you remember this one thing. Protecting your peace does not make you cruel. Sometimes it's the most honest form of self-respect you'll ever practice. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy real stories about family, dignity, boundaries, and the complicated process of learning how to protect your humanity without losing your heart.